Okay, who is Marcion and what's the Marcionite gospel? That's really what we're going to talk about today. And, there's lots of controversy that surrounded Marcion, especially in the early church and his connection to Rome and all of that. And so what I want to do is just back up just for a minute and kind of paint a very broad picture of what happened with Marcion, at least from what we can gather. Apparently, he was already a bishop or some way connected to leadership in the church, possibly in Pontus. Now, we can't obviously verify that. It's very difficult to go back that far and do that, especially since we're talking about, sometime in the 130s AD. But he's said to be the son of a bishop there in Sinope, and that at some point he was crossed with his father and left, but we're not sure if that story is apocryphal because it comes from a man named Epiphanius who writes about him some 300 years almost in the future. But nevertheless, we do know that he comes from Pontus. He makes his way to Rome in the 130s. And when he arrives in this place, he wants to be connected to the church, and apparently was a man of wealth, or his family was of wealth, because he gives the church 200,000 sesterces, and it apparently either in a quid pro quo fashion, or he gave it with the hope that someone would take that money and then use him as a church leader. It's difficult to say, but 200,000 sesterces is a lot of money, and there's not really a good way to translate that to modern dollars other than to say a few things about what you could do with that much money or what other people made. And I think a helpful way to look at that is to see what a Roman soldier made. I think on average somewhere around 1,200 sesterces a year. So if a Roman soldier made 1,200 sesterces a year and he donates 200,000 sesterces to the church, it's an incredible amount of money. I've seen ranges from $500,000 to $500 million that it would be worth today. And so doing those comparisons get really silly, but nevertheless, he gives them a ton of money and then is connected in some way with the leadership. Now, exactly how is unknown, but it's very difficult to arrange, meetings with and to talk through, what are scriptures, what aren't scriptures, and to deal with those things and be connected to the church in the way that Marcion was, if he wasn't some kind of a leader in the church. And so he begins to develop, though, this odd kind of theology, and some describe it as Gnostic Christianity. I know people like Ehrman said that he really shouldn't be thought of as a Gnostic because he really doesn't align completely with that, and I agree to a certain extent, but he does have Gnostic tendencies in his thought, and I'll go into detail a bit about what that means. He believed that there were basically two gods. There was a good God, and there was a bad God, and that's it. There were no other gods. There was only two, and that's why Ehrman says that he's not really a Gnostic, because he doesn't have all these many gods that would exist off in the pleroma, but nevertheless he was affected by it in some way, or affected by the Platonic thought that was in place at the time, and especially in the church, as they're trying to integrate what they already understood about the world, the foundation of the way that they saw things, and now they have this new information. This new information, what I'm going to do is try to integrate that into what I already understand. And I think you're going to see a common theme with many of those that were labeled as heretics, or people who mutilated scripture, who changed things to fit their agenda, as people who already had a way of thinking about the world, and they didn't do what Paul would say, renew their mind. They took this new information and tried to map it on to the way that they already understood the world. And he said that what convinced him was the account of Genesis, and he looks in Genesis and he says Yahweh is walking through the garden, which proves to him that he has some physical body and that he's limited. He doesn't have universal knowledge, and therefore he can't be the Most High God. He can't be a good God because he is a God that's about, retributive justice. He creates laws, and he punishes people and causes them to suffer, and that was all his doing. And then when we look, he says, at Jesus, we see that there's a God of love and of mercy and of grace, and one who's trying to free people from the trappings of the world. And that's the way that he saw things. And he develops essentially the first real list of some type of canon in that region, and it's his canon that he's developed from his thoughts. And his canon consisted of apparently the Gospel of Luke, although much shorter than our gospel. And the reason it's much shorter is because he removes the Old Testament references from the Gospel of Luke. He tries to remove a lot of the Jewish elements, but there's a few of them that are still kind of present there. In fact, some of the writings against him tell him that, there was still Jewish references in his gospel, but nevertheless. And he also keeps 10 books or 10 letters of Paul. He doesn't include the pastoral epistles. He only has 10 letters of Paul, and they are also shorter. And he's done the same thing to Paul's letters. He removes from them the notion that the Old Testament God, that Yahweh, that the Jewish God, was in any way connected to Jesus. And Jesus, therefore, had to be the son of the good God. And the son of the good God came to help people. The bad God was there only to hurt people. And that's essentially what it was. It was a good God, bad God, without going into even more detail than that. And it's a really dualistic kind of approach to things. And, Marcion, once he develops this view and people realize what it is, he's excommunicated from the church in Rome in the year 144. And, after his excommunication, you would think, well, now it's over. But it really wasn't. He went on to Anatolia and lived another almost 20 years, and he had many followers, not only in Anatolia, but also that were around Rome, and his followers stayed around for the next few hundred years. In fact, they don't fully kind of go away until they're absorbed into another heretical movement that comes along, one called Manichaeism, which is another dualistic kind of way of thinking. But his view of Jesus is quite different from the Orthodox view also. It isn't just that he's a good God and he's separate from the Old Testament God. His view is that Jesus is his appearance. He has an appearance of having flesh, but he didn't really have it. Basically, he was docetic, right? Jesus appeared to have flesh. He appeared to participate in the world like everyone else did, but he really didn't. He was sort of mapped into this world in order to rescue people from the trappings that the bad God had created. And, so Jesus doesn't suffer on the cross. He doesn't actually die. There isn't a resurrection. There's not a birth narrative. He removes all of those things. It's kind of an odd theological configuration that Marcion has, where he has some Gnostic tendencies, but he holds on just a few of the Christian doctrines, but not many. It's the bare bones of both of them, it seems, that he holds together. But nevertheless, he is very popular. But he's written against by a number of different people. Justin Martyr, who's around at that time. And then along later, Tertullian, and also Irenaeus. And, they call him like the spawn of Satan, the son of Satan, a heretic. They call him terrible things because from that view, that's what he was. And he was taking people from the church. He was an actual challenge because if you're having to write that much, it means there's not one or two guys, there's quite a few people that are participating in this movement. The Marcionites had kind of grown. And in fact, many of them moved with him, and he affected many people, as I stated before, for a couple hundred years. Upon Marcion's excommunication, he also proceeded to give his money back, the 200,000 sesterces. They gave it back to him and said, "We don't want you here." And when you have a struggling church like it was at that time, you have to mean business and realize that this guy is crazy. If I'm going to give him 200,000 sesterces back from wherever they had to collect that from, and give that to him and tell him to hit the road. We're told by Irenaeus, and I believe maybe Tertullian also, that he was an associate and maybe a pupil of a man named Serdo. And Serdo is important because he was a Gnostic, and he is said to have been the pupil of Simon Magus. And Simon Magus is in the book of Acts. He is the fellow that Simon Peter is, has to part ways with, because Simon asks Simon Peter if he could pay to have the power and the gifts that the apostles had. He wanted to know if he could actually purchase that. Otherwise, as Simon the magician and all the rest. And Serdo is said to have been one of his pupils who was still around at the time. We're also told that Marcion was a friend of a man named Valentinius, who we'll get into in the next episode, who was absolutely clearly a Gnostic. His views were the essential Gnostic in the way that he viewed things. So it's really difficult to kind of pin down Marcion and understanding exactly what he's doing there. But he's sort of trapped between these various different heresies and at the edge of the church. And, that theology, again, really didn't fit in anywhere. But nonetheless, he mutilated Scripture in order to propagate his views, and he took in many adherents of his views that lasted for quite a while. And I think that there are remnants of it, in fact, still left around today. That may be also, along with Manichaeism, either way, it doesn't make a difference. But sometimes I think the way that Christians view God and Satan is almost like the good God and the bad God, and one wants to bring you down, one wants to help you, and there's a little bit of that layover, but obviously not in the same way. But that dualistic way of thinking, was what got Marcion in trouble to begin with, as he tried to map all these things on to the Scriptures, and then therefore onto his theology and to the pupils that he had under his stead. Regardless of Marcion's particular theological persuasion, he left his mark on that world. And it caused the church, I think, to begin to take seriously threats to orthodox Christianity. And, it led to writings. He and others, their heresies led to writings from the early church, from people like Irenaeus and Tertullian, etc., in trying to safeguard the faith that had been handed down to them. And in doing so, it made them take seriously the notion that the Scriptures mattered, and began to collect those and look at them in a way that was different maybe than what had been going on before. Because, as noted in a previous episode, that even Justin Martyr, it appears, used some sort of harmony of the Gospels, at least of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and was using that to preach with, or nobody's certain about that, but he's using it at least at some point, and takes another look at those things and decide, is this the best way to move forward? And there was a look at the documents that the church was using that was powerful for those who were the Orthodox faith. And Marcion spurred that on, and so in some ways he helped to kick the church in the direction that it needed to go, so that it could safeguard the teachings for future generations. But nevertheless, Marcion was deemed a heretic, and his followers ended up eventually subsiding and going away, or being absorbed into Manichaeism, which came along later. Next time, we're going to dig into Valentinius, who was said to be his companion, and with a different document that it's noted that Valentinius created. See you guys next time.